Hello, folks. Today is a Wednesday night, and I have the privilege of having Kelsey Hightower here with me. Kelsey is a principal engineer at Google Cloud. Kelsey, thank you so much for taking time on a Wednesday evening to speak with me.
No, happy to be here.
What do you do as a principal engineer at Google? How does your regular day look like?
Yeah, so if I look through a regular day, there's going to be a lot of product work. So when you think about some of the services we offer, whether it's, serverless through products like Cloud Run, or maybe you're interested in Kubernetes and at Google Cloud, we have a managed service there. But there's a lot of features that go into evolving those products. And so a lot of those features are captured in like design documents. And the feedback loop that I help establish is number one, I'm still a practitioner. I think about these things in detail, but also the feedback we get from our peer engineers at other companies, like our customers. And also, there's just this customer feedback loop to make sure that we're always building various products that work for them. So much so that I even started what we call an empathetic engineering program. And that allows all of our software engineers to have an opportunity to participate in a program that helps them understand the customer's point of view when using our products, right? So we want them to have customer empathy when they're thinking about designing new features and so forth. And of course, I still do a bit of the public speaking because I'm very interested in open source and industry trends.
You're not born the principal engineer at Google Cloud, right? And I usually ask my guests, how did you get into computers? But I know that you started at an early age at McDonald's, right? So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that experience and what that helped you with.
Yeah, I think early in my career, like most people, you take the jobs you need when you need them. And so in high school, in 10th grade, my first job was at McDonald's because it was walking distance from my house so that I can get there on time after school. And I think no matter what job you hold in life, you always have the opportunity to learn something. And for me, I think I built a lot of character. Like I took a lot of pride in, simple things like keeping the lobby clean or making sure that the drive-through was never backed up and people got their food on time. And I became a shift manager. So here you are, the 16-year-old, 15-year-old kid has all the keys and is managing who should be working, who clocks in, who clocks out, and managing the operations for that amount of time. And I think for me, that helped me understand kind of the leadership qualities. Number one, I'm younger than most of the people that are working there, especially on the weekends, like during the morning shift. And so you have to earn their respect, right? They look at you as like, who is this kid telling me what to do? So I couldn't rely on bossing people around. I had to let them know that, listen, I'm a hard worker. I can do all of the jobs here on the floor. And if I give you, if I make a request for you to do something, it's to make sure that this operation runs smoothly and we all continue to get paid. So I think I learned even at that time how to lead by influence. And I think a lot of those attributes of my work ethic, paying attention to the entire system and not just one particular task, was something that I was able to carry over into my venture in the tech world.
If I understand correctly, you kind of evolved in your career and eventually went to work for Bell South, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I was introduced to computers in 11th grade because I moved from, you know, a different part of the United States to the other side of the country, and it caused me to miss a little bit of the school year. So I needed to make up some credit. So I joined uh, the Technology Student Association, TSA. And in that class, it was an after school program. So I was able to fit it into my work schedule. But ideally, what we did was we learned different parts of, I guess, engineering in general, some parts of basic programming, building bridges, AutoCAD. And so I had this kind of exploration of all of these technical skills that one could learn to go probably be a professional. And so when I decided not to go to college, I had to figure something out, right? And at that time, IT certifications were a pretty big deal. Like a lot of people, if you wanted hands on skills, these IT certifications around 1999, year 2000, it was a fast track, in my opinion, to acquire some of these skills. And this is right around the transition of high speed internet access, right? DSL, right? So Bell South, which is this telco in the United States, was replacing or giving people the opportunity to go from dial up 56K modems to high speed internet access, but it requires something different than the current technicians they had on staff. Those technicians were more used to running cables and, fixing stuff at the telco's provider at their data centers or their systems where they used to keep those things in their facilities. And so they needed a new breed of technical talent who understood how computers work, who could do troubleshootings, who could, you know, fix bugs on the computer that would make them not be able to get online. And so those IT certifications really opened up the door for me to be one of those technicians that went out and helped people get up and running with high speed internet access. Because at that time, we had to go door to door, right? These are service calls. You went on site, you did all the work there, and you moved on to the next customer.
And how was the day-to-day work with those customers, and what did you gain from those experiences with those customers?
Well, I think if anyone's ever done a job where you're working directly with the customer, you're going to have to figure out customer service at some point, right? Take your shoes off at the door. Make sure that you're doing work in a way that's respectful of the premises. The customer's watching you. And look, you're going to be, poking around their computer. So you got to make sure that you're very professional about every interaction that you do. And also, you got to make people feel comfortable, right? You're a stranger going into someone's home. So I think there's got to be this element of trust that needs to be established quickly so you can actually do your job and do it safely. And so, in addition to that, I really learned how to make sure that I could do the job effectively and efficiently. And so that really meant that I really needed to know what was going on. I really need to know how to troubleshoot because you don't have all the time in the world to do these service calls. Like you need to be in and out like under an hour, right? You cannot be there all day, especially if you have 8 other customers that need to go visit. So tactically, you made sure you had the right tools in your tool belt. You really couldn't learn on site with the customer, right? You would either have to say, "Hey, I don't have the right tools. I'm going to have to come back." And that disrupts everything. So you really had to learn to carry the right tools in your tool bag and analyze the situation. If you were going out to maybe a small business, then you probably needed a different set of tools with you because it may require you to run cables uh, through a wall that wasn't meant to do that. So you got to have your fish tape. You're going to have all these different tools that you typically don't take to a residential building. So, really, how to be a professional and conduct myself in a way that made people feel comfortable even when they're watching me work.
You mentioned that you have a pretty big interest in open source. How did you get into open source? Was it at this time in life or a little bit later?
Yeah, so when I was studying for these IT certifications, you know, in 1999, most of the, operating systems, all had a cost. Windows, if you think about Windows Server and the type of things required to even study those systems, there's a pretty hefty cost to even download that software and get started from an educational standpoint. So when I decided to get into this field, like most people at the time, I'm just looking at open job descriptions, right? And you start to see things like Solaris, AIX, Unix, and sometimes you would actually see like Linux. And you could tell that these companies were trying to make that, transition from these big, expensive, proprietary operating systems in the Unix space to some of these newer operating systems, including Linux. So I decided, like, wow, let me go see how accessible this stuff could be. And I remember going to Barnes and Noble, and I think I bought like a Linux Plus certification book or A Plus certification. And as part of those curriculums, they chose Linux as the thing that you would learn to understand the operating system fundamentals. And so I had an old kind of, I think it was like an HP laptop or something. And I put Linux on it. It's like, if I'm going to learn this thing, then goodbye Windows, hello Linux, and you get it all installed. And now you're forced to like learn the command line. The GUIs back then were not very sophisticated, but I kind of jumped in the deep end and just used the certification process to kind of guide my learning at that time. And open source was just like the only way someone like me at the time could afford to even be doing this. So I chose open source out of necessity. And it turns out it was just the most open and inviting ecosystem for someone like me to develop their skills.
You got into Python, you got into Puppet as well, right? So you eventually went to work for the company that was producing Puppet, and I think you moved to Portland. Can you tell us a little bit more about that phase in your life?
Yeah, you got to remember early on. I mean, there's a whole section of the story that you could probably have a whole podcast episode on. But when I got my IT certifications, I was very nervous about applying for the jobs that I saw because all of them wanted all of these years of experience that I didn't have. Back then, I thought you're supposed to have all the skills listed on the job requirement. So if I didn't have one or two of the skills, I didn't even dare to apply. And so the way I got that job at Bell South, it was a contractor, right? So they were just paying us per service call. And so when I got my IT certification, the place where you go take those certifications, these are like, someone will set up shop and, they will become official testing centers. And I remember, I think I almost got like a perfect score on one of those IT certifications. And I remember once you get certified, they would invite you back to say, hey, there are companies hiring people with your skills as long as you're certified and willing to learn. So I came back and I remember Bell South was just doing this big round of hiring all the people who at least got certified, right? That was enough for them to feel like you were qualified to start learning. And so when I got that job, it was kind of through this kind of like career fair at the particular testing center. And so from that job, I started my own business because I noticed that, look, I could start doing service calls to other businesses like small insurance companies. I even opened like this very small computer store. Now, listen, I didn't have a ton of cash, but somehow I figured out a way to make it work. And so I turned that, Bell South service calls into like my own business, hired a few of my friends. And I did that for a number of years because again, I was still too afraid to try to apply for a job at one of those corporate places. So I thought it was going to be easier just to start a business. And look, I lived off of that for a number of years. And when I got into the kind of corporate America, I remember my first job was a contractor at Google, actually, and a data center. And I worked inside of that data center just as a data center technician. And from there, I think about every 3 to 6 months, I would switch jobs because honestly, the more skills I gained, I got an opportunity to make way more money. And it was when I got into tech support, that's when I really started to say, okay, I'm really good at this system administration thing. I can troubleshoot stuff and I'm really good at this. And I learned actually how to write code. I started to learn things like Python, a little bit of PHP, uh, Pearl was still very big at that time. And so I started to understood that the next chapter of my career, if I really wanted to break out and start making a lot more money, I needed to learn how to write code. And since Python was a big part of my tool belt at the time, I decided that it will be my primary language. Fast forward a little bit. On my lunch break, I get an opportunity to go interview at a financial services company. And I remember after the interview, they gave me an offer which was double my salary at the job that I just took a lunch break from. And so when I started working there, I noticed that the fact that I worked at so many companies, I had all of this experience. Like I'm only about 5 years into the industry at this point, maybe six. But I felt like I had 20 years of experience because I've gotten into so many things. I've learned so many things that when I introduced Python as a way of solving problems at that institution, I noticed that I needed to surround myself around people that could actually push me further. So I went to a meetup and gave a talk about how Python was being used at that financial services company to solve specific tasks. And that's when I was hooked. So I went from someone that was just using open source tools because they were free to a person that joined an open source community because I felt like I could actually grow as a person in a community that was building this stuff.
And how did you end up going to work for the company that was managing Puppet at the time?
So what's interesting is, I was at that financial institution for 3 years. And when I got there, most people were doing things somewhat manually, right? We had what we call these run books or a bill guide. So if you wanted to deploy software, you would go and find the right documentation and you would try to follow it step by step. And you would do it very slowly and very carefully to make sure you didn't break anything. And you would just do that like many times a day. And that was just how they were doing deployments. So I'm sitting there and I remember I joined that company right around the holidays. So since I was new and everybody else had been there for a while, of course, they took their vacation time and they were gone. So I was there. And it turns out we were actually building a new platform, a new payments platform. And so I was there by myself and I was like, you know what? I'm going to write a little script to automate all of these steps that I keep typing in over and over. And so then when people would ask me to do a deployment, instead of it taking like an hour, I would do them like every 5 minutes. And they were like, "Yo, how are you doing all of these deployments by yourself at this speed?" I was like, I got this little script and, I'm just running it. Every time you guys ask me to do something, I just change this one thing and run the script again and then it's done." And they're just like, "Oh, wow, this is amazing." Funny enough though, when you automate things like that, a lot of people become super fearful. "Hey, what are you doing? That was not approved. That's not allowed. You need to go back and follow the steps that everyone else is doing. You could break something." And that's kind of when I learned that, listen, just because you're innovative or you have new ways of doing things, that's usually very hard to do, number one, but it's not going to be the hardest thing you will do. The hardest thing you would do is to get consensus, get everyone to agree that there should be a different way and they shouldn't be as scared of the automation. Eventually, my mindset and my approach, we're talking like, I don't know, 6 more months for people to say, "Hey, maybe other people should be using the script as well." And I decided that, look, the script couldn't be the right way of doing this. There has to be a better framework. And I ran across Puppet. And so Puppet was at version 0.24 or something like that because it was an RPM inside of Red Hat. And I was like, let me install this Puppet thing to see what this is about. And it's like, oh, this is really cool. Instead of me just scripting things in bash scripts, I can actually use this structured language. And I learned Ruby or just enough of Puppet to actually just use the Puppet DSL to start actually automating this stuff and something that was a little bit more, at my opinion, a little bit more structure, some documentation, and just like that Python community, there was a whole community around Puppet. It took me about a year and a half probably to go from teaching enough people to start to trust that Puppet was the right solution for what we were trying to do. And when I mean from zero to production, I'm meaning every server is running Puppet. All of our deployments are fully automated through Puppet. And even at that moment, I learned that no one wanted to use Puppet, right? People like, we don't really care about Puppet. It's cool. It can do all these wonderful things, but we don't really want to be running the Puppet code or writing Puppet code. There has to be a better way. And so at the time, since Puppet was so new almost to everyone, it wasn't even 1.0 yet. And so when I introduced this thing, a lot of the central IT people were like, "Yo, what is this? Like, we've never heard of this. Why are you using it?" And this is also financial services and regulation. So they had tons of questions. To start to wrap up the story a little bit, one thing I had to do to make people comfortable was integrate Puppet into all the existing change management systems. And so I built this integration with Jira, right? This ticketing system. And back then, we had a lot of approvals to deploy a new version of the software. And so what I ended up doing was making sure all of our software had an RPM package. So that way I can create a custom dropdown in Jira. So you can just pick the RPM at the right version and tell me in the ticket what environment or what server you would like that software to run on. Now, what they didn't know is behind the scenes, I was just feeding all of the information from the Jira ticket once it was approved, and I was just giving it to Puppet. so it could actually make it happen. And then I would have Puppet, and I built some, custom integrations that would write back to the ticket. One day, my boss went to a conference and he came back and he said, Kelsey, I now realize what you have been doing these last couple of years. And I was like, what? He's like, you're doing DevOps. I was like, I have no idea what that means. I'm just trying to be productive by learning as many skills as possible. The other thing that was weird about that was, even though I had all of this success, I did all the hard work of getting things to production. I brought people along with me, trained new people, hired new people. In many ways, I do think I can take a little credit for changing the mindset of how that company worked. There was still a little bit of doubt. And I remember he went out and met one of the people who worked at Puppet Labs, actually a guy named James Turnbull. And he wrote the book on Puppet, the book that I was reading. And so he invited him to our office. And he was like, "Hey, team, I want you all to meet James. I know him from, you know, conferences, or somehow he's met him. And he want us to present how we were using Puppet so he can give us some pointers on maybe doing it better." So I'm super excited. Now, here's the funny thing. As we get into the elevator, James Turnbull, my manager, and a couple of people from my team, and we're going from the first floor to the third floor. And my boss says, "Hey, James, I want to introduce you to Kelsey." And James says, "Oh, you're Kelsey Hightower. You're the guy that has been contributing to open source Puppet. We love the work that you're doing. Can't wait to see how you're using Puppet here." And my boss looks at me and is like, "Wow, James knows who you are already." He said it with his eyes, not necessarily with his words. And so when we get upstairs, I'm showing James, like, "Hey, really, look, Puppet can be complicated. We don't expect everyone to write Puppet code. We're deploying this stuff across the whole enterprise." So I showed him the Jira system that I had, put together, and how people could just pick a version and deploy it anywhere, all the way to production. And we had all the audit logs that a financial institution would need, and that Puppet was just hidden underneath. And I remember at that point in time, James said, "Wow, this is truly amazing. I'm not sure if I've seen anything like this before. You guys are way ahead of the curve." 3 months later, I give a keynote at PuppetConf, the first Puppet conference around 2012. I fly to Portland, Oregon, where Portland headquarters are located, and I give this talk about one of these new Puppet features. And while I was in town, they asked me to interview. And when I went back to work, I told my boss that I was resigning because I just accepted a job offer to go work at Puppet Labs.
At what point in time did you realize that containers and cloud technology in general were the area to get into?
So at Puppet, I was an engineer working on, core Puppet, the open source team. And so, we would fix bugs and tickets, and we would really try to figure out, because at the time there was new competitors. Ansible was a competitor to Puppet, and it came out and it chose Python and YAML as its DSL. There was Chef. And so we saw this explosion of configuration management tools. And I remember we bought this company called M Collective, and there was a lead engineer there, the open source maintainer named Ari. And him and another guy named Daniel Pittman, we used to talk about Puppet was not enough to automate actual software. It was great for configuring servers, but it wasn't really great at configuring applications, because Puppet had no concept of an independent app. It only knew how to configure a server. And so you would actually always have to do everything based on the context of a server. You couldn't say, put 3 of these apps somewhere. That wasn't a construct in Puppet. And so around 2014, two things happened. One, Puppet was also looking at more performant programming languages. So we were using Ruby for everything. But once you start to have a lot of nodes calling back into our Ruby API, it turns out most of Ruby is like single threaded performance. So you could get the thundering herd problem that would overload the Puppet server. Some teams went off and did things, I believe, in some variant of Java, because there was support for JRuby. And the idea was that if we rewrote some of the services in a more performant language, then we can actually move forward much quicker. I, on the other hand, was more interested in something like the Go programming language, right? I think Go had gotten very close to 1.0, and I started rewriting some of the Puppet services in Go. And I remember it was like, well, Go is not supported on things like AIX or Solaris at the time. And also, what were we going to do about all of these Ruby plugins? So, there was a lot of pushback on adopting Go, even though I thought it was the perfect system language to be building these type of tools so we can actually remove the Ruby dependency and we could solve the performance problem by having a language with concurrency built in. Another thing happened. Go, and I think I was onto something, and so was everyone else, because Go ended up being the language that Terraform was written in by HashiCorp. It was also the programming language that Docker was eventually written in as well. And so when I saw Docker, because I was just looking for all the projects in the Go community just to find some good examples. And so when I saw Docker for the first time, I looked at it and I realized that it was like the missing component. Instead of configuring servers, and one thing I realized when I was at Puppet, all this configuration management stuff was really about giving the server an API it never had. So even though we were automating things, we never really had a new abstraction. We were just writing in some ways better shell scripts. We had a high level DSL, but if you looked at what happened once it got compiled, it almost looked like a bunch of bash scripts that were running in a certain order. So we were still doing things the same way we were doing it before. We just had a better framework, but Docker was very different. Docker just said, what if we just change the abstraction? So less about configuring a server, and now what we can do is have an app become self-contained, and therefore we don't automate Java, Ruby, and Python. We automate containers. And the funny thing ever was when this thing started to really make industry noise, it was almost a bad word inside of Puppet. Like you just couldn't talk about it. It was seen as this thing that was challenging config management because at the time people were like, yo, Puppet is the old way and this is going to be the new way forward and we don't need configuration management. At least that's what the industry was saying. And I knew that wasn't going to always be true, but they were onto something. A new abstraction was in order.
You eventually went to work for Core OS, right? So can you tell us a little bit about how was the path from Puppet and all the way to Core OS, and how was the work over there?
So I didn't go straight to CoreOS. I actually went to a very small startup. They weren't actually a startup. They were a pretty mature company. They were just pretty small called Monsoon Commerce. And I met some really cool friends that I still have today. One of them name is Billy Cleat. He's probably still the Vim Go maintainer. So the Vim plugin for the Golang language. And at that company, I was really excited because a lot of the services they had a bunch of microservices. They were doing a lot of things right. Some stuff was written in Java, but some of the language choices were so heavy that they had a very expensive cloud bill. Everything was in Amazon. And if you looked at some of the, performance issues we were having, most of them were somewhat related to the runtime to some degree, especially the way we were writing Java code. There's better ways to write Java code, of course. And I was very interested in Go. So at that place, I was the engineering leader across a couple of states. So I probably had no business writing code at that point, but I couldn't let this Go thing not be something we experimented with. So two things happened. One, when I left Puppet, I realized if Docker is going to be a thing, then how much configuration management do you actually need? And so I wrote this tool called ConfD. And what ConfD did was it took maybe the most useful part of Puppet that I think still needed to be around, which was this idea that you still need a way to take key values and turn them into a configuration file and distribute them to the right machine or server just in time. So the way ConfD worked, and it's still an open source project today, I don't really maintain it as much, but ConfD, when you install it on the server, you basically can have these Golang templates that knew how to pull data from multiple sources. And then it will regenerate the template and put it in the right place on the server. This was the perfect combination to go along with something like Docker. Docker decouples the app from the server and compd would do the same for the config file. No more Puppet required. And the funny story is, I know all the folks at HashiCorp, and compd was used with things like console and etcd to generate config files, because I thought that, look, no one's going to really just call a database or a key value pair server to get their config. That's just too advanced. You need something in the middle that can translate between these key value stores like console or etcd and still produce a normal config file just the way Puppet did it. So that's what I did. But I wasn't really willing to keep adding all of these backends. And so eventually those ideas were borrowed, like compd became console templates, right? And I remember it kind of blew up on Hacker News, right? That's like this news sites where we talk about these new things. And someone's like, wow, console template ripped off compd. And I remember responding to that thread, and I think it's still up. And I said, no, this is not, the team asked me to add some features to compd, and I didn't want to. And they said that we're going to do our own project. And I said, fine. And I think of it as a privilege that my project is inspiring a new project. And it's okay, because that's the heart of open source. So at Monsoon Commerce, we eventually rewrote most of the services from either Node.js or Java or Python to be mostly Go because of the performance boost. I think we saw like a 70% drop in memory utilization, and we saved a ton of cache on our VM instances. And that was like a great sign to me that we can actually write Go code in production. I had a lot of success with compd. And then I remember that same year, there was a conference, the first Go conference, and I was there and I got one of my talks accepted. And I was showing how Go, I think, is going to be the new system administrators kind of choice instead of Python. So I think my talk was called Go for System Admins. And that's the same conference where I just jumped on stage to be the MC for the whole conference. So now I'm on stage, like as the MC introducing the speakers. And then I remember introducing myself as well. And so from that interaction, it was funny that I met the CoreOS team probably a little bit before the Go conference. And I was like, I really want to get into the container space. And so I don't think they were quite sure what my role would be, because, I'm an engineer, I'm an engineering leader, I contribute to open source projects. What could I do at CoreOS? Because I wasn't really like using distributed systems in the way that they were building out, like etcd and all of these things. This is pre Kubernetes, but Docker was definitely a thing. And so I joined CoreOS, and I'm learning all about etcd. I'm learning all about the custom operating system that we had. And of course, I finally made it. I can now work on containers full time. And something else interesting happened. All of that experience I had from my early days in the Python community, speaking at conferences, I also used to contribute to disutils, which is a package management solution in the Python space back then. And so I noticed that every time we built something new at CoreOS, because all of our projects were open source, I was like the person who would introduce every feature to the world, right? We would go to a local meetup, or I would go to, we had a monthly meetup at the Rackspace office in San Francisco, and I would show every feature. And what I noticed, since I was learning about distributed systems, I was reading the white papers, and then I was translating that into a way that everyone could understand. I think I ended up becoming seen as this person to navigate you through all of this container stuff, all of these distributed systems. And so that's what I started to do at CoreOS. I eventually became the product manager. And some would say, even though that wasn't my title at the time, the chief advocate as well.
At some point in time, I think you're talking to NASA about an opportunity there, and I think you're also talking with Google, and you're kind of in between those options there. Can you tell us a little bit about that part of your life?
Yeah, but at that point in time, I had probably been in IT or tech for maybe, I don't know, 14 years at that time. And so I got to the point where at CoreOS, I was also one of the people that were dealing with a lot of our potential customers. In many ways, even though we didn't have executive titles, I was doing a lot of that executive work. And so NASA was using some of this stuff in open source. At the time when Kubernetes started to really get hot, I was a contributor to Kubernetes. And so I would contribute in the nighttime before, CoreOS decided that we were also going to pivot towards Kubernetes. And so I kind of built up this rapport in the Kubernetes community. I remember, I think I wrote the first installation guide. A lot of the things that I worked on were really about making sure that it integrated well into existing environments. And so I remember going on site to NASA, that's the space program in the United States. And that division of NASA was adopting things like containers and Kubernetes. And I remember spending like a whole day on site, just showing the team as much as I know about Kubernetes, how it could help them. And I remember like it was such a great experience. They gave me a tour of the campus. The Mars rover that they shot to Mars, like the new one. They were showing me the prototype of it, and they took me where it was driving around in circles. They were teaching me about like the wheels and why they had to change them because of the old Mars rover. And I had this feeling that this is technology with a real high purpose. These people are trying to figure out how to go to Mars. And I felt this deep sense of purpose, like watching them use technology to do this. And I remember interviewing with the team, and I just felt like there was so much purpose that at that stage of my career, I was like, let me try to do something like this. And so the job opportunity was to come and lead that team of people, JPL, Jet Propulsion's lab, and help them get their IT systems in order, leverage the cloud, leverage on-prem, but leverage open source to do it. I agreed. I was preparing my family. We were going to move to California. I was going to take that role. And I remember getting this call from Google. And I told them, listen, I already accepted this job at NASA. I'm going to go work on the Mars mission. Like, this is amazing. This is what I want to do. And they said, look, just give us a shot. And long story short, uh, from a monetary standpoint, the offer was just too big to refuse. And it just turns out, though, that going to Google, and I remember I talked to the NASA, I think I met the CTO at the time of JPL. He said, Kelsey, it's going to take 20 years to get to Mars. How about this? Take the Google offer. And if it doesn't work out, you can always come back here in plenty of time. So that's what I did. Unfortunately, Google, I guess fortunately, Google was amazing. What I thought was going to be a 2-year thing, I've been there for over 6 years now. So I think it worked out well.
No kidding. Through the conversation here, it's pretty clear to see the importance that open source and your contributions to open source have had in your career and also in other people's careers as well, right? So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the work that you do with the CNCF and also with KubeCon.
The story behind KubeCon is very complicated because this was the first time in my career that I saw the other side of open source. When I was contributing to the Python community, I remember going to the Python conference, and people like Guido van Rossum were there, and all of these people that I looked up to. They were just working on this as a foundation. They were not a business. They weren't charging money. They just had enough funding to make sure that the language would progress. And so that's just how I thought all open source projects were. And so when Kubernetes came out, you know, I was in the Kubernetes documentary. It's a really great documentary that kind of goes through some of the complexities of that time. But remember, at this time, everyone was trying to build a business around open source. And so when Kubernetes came out, it was very organic, grounds up. Google started the project. Red Hat was there as an early collaborator, and it felt like this is going to be the new Linux. But at that time, though, the cloud is really hot. Startups are like trying to figure out how to build their next business. VCs, they're ready with their dollars. And you had these existing players like VMware, Cisco, Red Hat, and you had all these startups like Docker and CoreOS. And they're all kind of feeling like there's this war for like who's going to become the new Red Hat? Who's going to become the new tech giant for the enterprise software space? And I think in some ways, Kubernetes became its battleground. So in the early days, people didn't know that Kubernetes would be successful. I remember a lot of people were just like, oh my God, it's not as performant or scalable as something like Mesos. So there was a lot of experimentation. Docker had a tool called Docker Swarm. HashiCorp had a tool called Nomad. And then there was also this kind of incumbent, which was Mesos. And that was being used by all the big companies at the time, or at least some of them. And so this Kubernetes thing was like, people weren't sure if it was going to be successful or not. So there was no foundation. It was on GitHub. There's some clean rules about how to contribute. A person like me found it easy to just jump in and get started. I submitted some patches, they got merged. I started talking about it, people listened. And so the community was just very growing, very bottoms up. So then I remember more startups came. And one in particular was called Kismatic. And Patrick Riley and Joseph Jacks, they kind of had this vision. And I remember maybe that GopherCon conference, that Go conference that I was the MC at. A couple of years later, they wanted to replicate the community aspect that the Go programming language had and do the same thing for Kubernetes because there was no conference at the time. And so since I was the MC of GopherCon and I had a little bit of experience with like, conferences and public speaking, and in some ways, some people would say at that time, I was kind of becoming the voice of Kubernetes. And so Joseph Jackson, Patrick Riley, they're at the Gopher conference. It's like, we should do a conference for Kubernetes. I was like, yeah, I would love to. And so I think for them, and I was at CoreOS at that time, and they were kind of somewhat competitors, but I never really treated them that way. They had this idea that if we did this conference, we would bring the whole community together and unify our approach. And so I remember getting the emails for the logos. And I remember Joseph Jacks, he presented one of the 3, 4 choices. And the sailboat that you see today was one of those logos. And I was like, that's the right one, right? It's the whole ship thing. It looks like the Docker lineage. Like, this is perfect. And so they put up the money. Kismatic did, and they rented out a hotel in San Francisco. And I'm not sure a lot of people agreed with them starting the conference, but I thought they were the perfect group to start the conference. They were a very small startup. They were focused on producing a pure, open Kubernetes distribution. And so when they asked me to also MC the conference, so I guess technically I was one of the founders of the KubeCon conference and branding. And so when they asked me to be the MC, and we put up the speaker page, I think then some other people in the community started to come around. So then Red Hat becomes a sponsor, Google is a sponsor. And again, I'm not working at Google at this time. And so I remember we do the first event and I'm on stage and I'm feeling really great because like the Go community is amazing. This container space is amazing. And then we took that same energy. And what I learned is that the community will adopt the same energy as the people who they put in charge of those communities. And so I brought this togetherness. I remember every time I got on stage, I was switching my t-shirt to be representative of all the startups that were building in the space and even the big companies as well. I would just keep switching my shirt. And I think everyone noticed that I was trying to bring people together, even in appearance. And I remember being in that audience and I asked everyone that was running Kubernetes in production to raise their hand. It was not a lot of hands. There was probably like 500 people at the event, and not a lot of hands went up. And it was kind of embarrassing. I think the video is still out there. And I asked everyone to just come on stage that's using Kubernetes in production. I also said something like, "You're probably lying because this thing is not stable to run in production. But either way, come on stage." And that was the first KubeCon event. And we did maybe 2 or 3 more before I think the politics caught up to everything. Think about this, right? You got this small startup that invented this thing called KubeCon. All the sponsors want to be connected to Kubernetes in some way, and this was the only way. Now, there were some things that needed to happen because if you're Amazon or you're Microsoft Azure or you're all these other entities, there's no way you're going to use a project like Kubernetes if it's not in the foundation. That made a lot of sense. There's a lot of other details in there, but we don't need to go into all of those. But long story short, the Linux Foundation was also trying to make sure that even Docker found a way to standardize some of those things. So the Open Container Initiative was born, OCI. And in addition to all of that, the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, was also born. And there was a lot of worry that it was just going to be the Kubernetes foundation because that's all anyone wanted to talk about. Even though there were projects like Prometheus and all these other things out there, Kubernetes, without a doubt, was like the big draw. And so when Kubernetes became part of the CNCF, that gave people this framework to say, hey, if any of these projects need a place to live, they could come to the CNCF. But the weird thing that happened was there was a lot of contention that it can't just be a Google only project. And also, they didn't want the whole CNCF to just be about Kubernetes. So we ended up doing this weird thing where number one, they had to take over the brand of KubeCon. Things happened. CNCF now is in control of KubeCon. And so now we have a side by side conference. It's kind of weird. I remember it was called CNCF Con plus KubeCon, like together, because the community wasn't quite ready for these things to be one, right? Kubernetes is the thing that people were coming from for. No one was really coming for the other projects, not at that time. So Kubernetes was still the anchor. And um, I didn't want anything to do with it, actually. I kind of felt like the community was being stolen from the people who started it. And I just didn't want it to be corporate driven, pay for play. We just didn't want that to happen. And so I remember, like, you know what? I'm not going. If this is what we're doing now, I'm okay. I just won't be participating and I'm not going to make a lot of noise about it. And I think I actually saw how they were running things. I think they did a pretty good job of being neutral, not playing favorites. And so I didn't MC the conference that year, I don't believe, and nor did I chair the conference, meaning like I did in years prior, making sure we had the right speakers, the right content. And so I went to that conference, but they did ask me to give a talk because it will be very weird if all of a sudden Kelsey's no longer here. So I give this talk, and I remember at the same conference, I didn't know it, they gave me this award. It was the CNCF Ambassador Award. It was like the first award that was given out and was for my work in bootstrapping the Kubernetes community. And I remember Chris gave me this award. I think he's like the CTO of the CNCF. He holds a pretty high position there. And he gave me this award. And I remember I walked out, I shook Chris's hand, took my award, waved at the crowd. And at this point, we're what, 3,000 people maybe? And I just go right back to the back. And I realized I don't necessarily need to think about this as a corporate event. And my mind immediately switched. I'm in the back now, sitting with my award in hand, and Chris is about to introduce the next segment or the next speaker. And I get up and I go back on stage. And I say, hold on, Chris. Can I say a few things? I probably should have said something earlier. And I asked everyone if you actually followed this tutorial that I wrote called Kubernetes the Hard Way, and I wrote that for the community, could you raise your hand? And it's like, and I can swear it's thousands of people. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but it felt like thousands of people raised their hand. And with their hands raised in the air, and I said, this is what this award represents. We do this for the community. That's what this is all about. Never forget that. And I hand the back to Chris, and I go back to the back. And I looked at that award and I said, that's what this means. And that's what this community will always mean.
I think that's a great segue for my next question. And I think I'm going to read a phrase that I think you said some time ago. There's just no way you're going to produce the best of everything without a little bit of everyone. And my question is, can you please tell us a little bit of your work with Google on inclusion and retention?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, Google is a global company. And so all around the world, there are people contributing to Google in some way, whether it's making sure that our products and services work in the local language or engineers that are actually building first class features across all of our particular products. I mean, I think at this point, there's probably over 100 plus languages spoken at Google in some way. And so when you think about a global company that is selling to billions of users, right? Like some of the products have literally billions of users. And so in that way, you can't have one group of people trying to build everything for the world. It just doesn't work actually. And there's a lot of nuance that goes into these things. So when you think about diversity and inclusion, it's a very complicated topic because every society has a different set of problems that need to be solved. So typically when you hear people talk about this, they give a very US centric response. And that's not representative of the whole world. So I won't do that here. But when I think about making sure you have access to all the world's talent and then retaining that talent is incredibly hard. Every company has room for improvement there. But for me, the way I look at this is that a lot of these opportunities start well before someone applies for a job. In the case of me, this started years ago through open source. If you think about it, Google was a big supporter of the Python Foundation back when I was learning and speaking about Python many years ago. And so my connection to Google began at that time because I always saw Google as this company that was contributing to all the open source projects. They were publishing all these white papers, the same ones that produced the ideas that we see in Kubernetes today. That's where the recruitment process starts. And so for me as an engineer, I consider Google the best in that area of computing. And so it was always kind of this idea that I can ever go and work in that space that would be really cool because I really respected those contributions. Now, once you kind of open up the doors for the world's best talent to work together, so that's what the power of open source is. So it's not just about working at Google, it's actually sometimes working with Google through these open source projects. And I think that's where we get a lot of that wide net open opportunities. Now, internally, the biggest challenge that I've seen in my entire career is like how do you welcome the world's best talent and allow them to execute? This is the part that's hard because, I come from an underrepresented group. The last thing we want to do is come to work and then have to spend all of our time trying to be accepted by our colleagues. That's not why I was hired. I want to be an engineer too, like everyone else. And so at most companies, I think that's the biggest challenge. How do you make sure that you create an environment where a person can come and do the job? What we don't want to do, not in all cases, we don't want to spend all of our time making DEI work the job. And so the one thing that made it click for me as an engineer and the approach that I've taken is to really understand the value of having a great team on your side. And I think I've told this story many times before, but it really stuck with me. When I'm coming back from a talk and I had my Google Cloud backpack, I slide it under the seat. I'm sitting in first class. I got a window seat. And so I'm sitting down, and then the person next to me, he's a black guy. I think I asked him what he did. And I think he was running one of like the Black History museums in Atlanta. And he also talks to um, tech leaders around the world about DEI. And I asked him to explain his work to me. And so I'm sitting, and he says, "Look around this plane." Now we're both sitting in first class. He says, "Think about this plane. We have hot food, we have internet access, nice seats, 30,000 feet in the air." But if you think about it, the aviation industry is less diverse than the tech industry. So even though this plane is nice, this is not the best plane that's possible. It's only the plane that a subset of humans could build because the aviation industry has never been accessible to all the people in the world. We're talking every country, every nation, every social class. We're not getting all of these people working in that particular space. And honestly, I kind of knew all these ideas. I knew all these things about being valuable, but it just really clicks for you when you understand that even if you are successful today with the team you have, how much did you lose by not having access to the very best people possible from all backgrounds? So, success is not a great indicator that you've actually done a great job because you will never know how much you actually cost yourself because you don't have an environment that can attract and retain the best talent.
You have been dealing with some of the most complex technologies that we have in terms of computers and everything else. Is there anything or any area, specific area of technology that you do not work with today, but you'd like to have an opportunity to work with that at some point in time in your career?
I think from a fundamental standpoint, I've kind of gotten to the point where I strongly believe that all of this stuff is in service of human beings. That's it. Like that tool belt that I had at Bell South. These are just tools to ideally accomplish some goal. And I really had to think about that quite a bit because we can get lost really quickly in the idea that Kubernetes is everything or serverless is everything. But when we step back, what we then realize is they're just pieces of this puzzle. But if you zoom back even further, then you realize that the puzzle should actually be of something like a big picture, right? When you buy a puzzle, you look on the box, you see the big picture. So when you open the box, you see a bunch of pieces that if you put them together the right way, ideally, you get to the big picture you saw in the box. And so when we lose sight of that, then we start to think about like these individual technologies. So for me, from a fundamental perspective, I have a good grasp of networking. I have a good understanding of the power that machine learning can bring. This idea that we can use data to help us predict and recommend things based on context. You know, someone is wanting to play a song for this person. What song should we recommend to that person? Or if you want to think about medical procedures, when we can have, or medical treatment, when we have designer drugs that are tailored just for you and your makeup as a person. And so when we think about all of this power, the thing that's most interesting to me is the closer we can get to actually not, I don't think we can solve human problems, we can help. So when we do get good ideas, can we use the technology to make those ideas accessible to everyone in the world? That is probably what I'm looking forward to the most. So when I see an interesting piece of technology, I always ask myself, what piece of the puzzle is this? And if it fits, what is it actually contributing to? What's the big picture?
Do you have any recommendations for those that want to get into computer science now? Like I mentioned to you, mostly our audience are folks from Brazil who are trying to decide if they're going to computer science, if they're going to programming. What would you recommend for those people right now?
Computer science is great. No problem with computer science. Nothing wrong with knowledge. But when we think about the permission that you need to build things, you really don't need permission to build things, right? If you have a piece of wood and a hammer and some nails, you can build things. Does that make you a carpenter? Does it matter? Does it really matter? You can learn from a carpenter that you probably need to have a saw because you can't build everything you want to build with just a hammer alone. So there's a lot of value in learning from people who have done something or built something before. So that's the way I think about these curriculums. Whether you go to college and you study computer science, maybe you go to a code school where you learn how to program in 9 months. But either way, you're going to be learning for the rest of your life. There's going to always be value in learning new skills so you can build new things. But the thing I want people to really think about is, what are you trying to build? Once you understand that part, then the next task is to acquire the skills necessary so you can build those things. And there's nothing wrong with taking the path where you go get a certification. Maybe that's the right path for you to get the skills you need to build the things that you want. Sometimes it's going to be an internship at a company that's going to let you practice building those things. So I think the most important thing here is that try your best to acquire the skills necessary to build the things you want to build. And if you can't possess all of those skills, then try to get a set of skills that will complement other people with those skills so you can build things together.
We have been talking here for a little over 1 hour. Are there any questions that you believe I should have asked you that I did not ask yet?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. I realize that some of these stories I've never told before, and that's always a good sign. So I think you did a good job.
Thank you. Any plans for the future that you could share with us?
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes, I don't even know where it comes from, but it's easy to predict the future when you're working on it. And so the things that we're working on, and the reason why I love working at, Google in particular, they're exposed to a lot of problems globally, big problems, small problems, and everything that we do towards fixing those things creates the future. It will be the future version that someone would use to do something. So when I think about the problems we're trying to solve, earlier in this podcast, we talked a lot about trying to deploy software by scripting or following a run book or learning all these things about Linux and Puppet. And like, that's like 20 years of my life doing roughly the same kind of thing. I have an application and I just want to make it available to the world. Why does it take so much to do something that we've been doing for so long? So I think the future, at least in this computing space, there has to come a time where once I have my application ready to go, I should be able to give it to some API or to some service and say, run it for me. There should be no need for me to have to learn all of these things to do such a well defined task. So when that future shows up, we're going to enable a lot of people to build a lot of things that I think, even in the world of open source where the software is free, the experience and the time isn't.
Do you have any recommendations for books or music or movies or games or anything that interests you?
There's so many things to recommend, but I think the thing I will recommend is enjoy them all. Because one thing that I realize is that all of the ideas that you have, even for technology, they come from somewhere. And they come from the human experiences, the things that people write about in those books. Human experiences are often expressed through the music, through the movies, through all of these things. So I would say is just learn to appreciate all of those things. Doesn't really matter what music you listen to. I like a range of music, but I also like music that makes me feel something, feel excited, feel sad, feel motivated. That's the power of music, in my opinion. It's just that we get to share these stories and also just give people something to feel. And sometimes get those very same people to take action. When it comes to things like books and movies, I love the complexities of exploring human and technology. I love sci-fi for that very reason. Recently finished up a series on Apple TV called the Foundation series, and it's based on the book called, the Foundation series, and it's part of a larger series of an author by um, Isaac Asimov. And the reason why I love the Foundation series is also connected to the iRobot series, but that whole universe really just talks about how far can we push this stuff until either A, it collapses, or we can't distinguish the difference. And so for me, that's the challenge that humanities have, because with all of these technological advances, and we don't pay attention to what it's all for, then we will just end up building these machines to destroy ourselves. Makes no sense. So I really enjoy books like that can marry the two things that I care most about, is like the human condition and the technology that we can decide to put to service to improve that human condition, or to make it worse.
Foundation was absolutely fantastic. I think Apple did a pretty good job with that as well. Before we close, is there anything that you'd like to mention in terms of a social network or contact, or anything else you'd like to mention?
Well, I spend a lot of my time on Twitter, and social media in general can be a very wild place. Lots of people use that social channel for various things. For me, I like to try new ideas or at least express my understanding of new ideas. So in that scenario, I really do like the idea of learning something. I call it learning in public. So for me in particular, learning in public is really about this idea of, hey, I'm trying something new. Here's where I am. And then ask questions, get feedback. And I notice that when I do that, I get to grow my community. I meet new people all the time. Sometimes I'm meeting the people who created those new projects or ideas, or I'm meeting someone like me that is still learning and they have questions. And then we get to meet and we can have a one on one to talk a little bit about why that technology exists, what we were doing before, should it be improved, um, where should you use it, where should you not use it. And so to me, this idea of social media gives us this ability to kind of keep the community going, even when we can't be in person. So if it's something, if you ever want to reach out to me, I'm at Kelsey Hightower on Twitter. But more importantly, um, appreciate this opportunity that you have to pick and join a community where you can add some value, and hopefully that community will turn around and add a lot of value to you.
It's almost 8:30 p.m. on a Wednesday, and I just want to take a moment here to thank you for dedicating, all your time and your work to the community here. And it's been a privilege to speak with you today. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.